Greetings. I'm Mark Kennedy, a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center, who had the opportunity to serve with the predecessors of our two guests when I represented Minnesota in Congress. This program is co-hosted by the Wilson Center's Asia program and the Kissinger Institute for China in America. We are honored to welcome a bipartisan pair of senior members of the U.S. House Armed Services Committee to the Wilson Center today. Representative Donald Norcross from the 1st District of New Jersey, who chairs the Subcommittee on Tactical Air and Land Forces, and Representative Rob Whitman from the 1st District of Virginia, who is the vice-ranking member of the full committee and the ranking member of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee. Today, we are going to focus on their recent trip to the Pacific together, stopping in Guam, Australia, Vietnam, and ever so briefly in the Philippines, to better understand the dynamics of a region that impacts America's prosperity and security. My experience in Congress was that there is no better way to bridge the divide between parties than to have to travel long distance with members from the other party. Thank you both for devoting time to engaging in the bipartisan manner. Given that the committee they represent and lead sets a direction for hundreds of billions of dollars of military expenditures directed in significant part to deter aggression in the region they visited, seeing it firsthand better informs them of the challenges and opportunities we face. Thank you for becoming better informed about how best to do the work you do in Congress, and thanks for taking the time to share your insights with us today. My co-moderator today is Shihoko Goto, Director of the Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Geoeconomics here at the Wilson Center, who will ask the first question.
Thank you, Congressman Kennedy, and thank you so much for joining us today, Congressman Norcross and Congressman Whitman. Time is the most valuable commodity in Washington, and I would like to echo Congressman Kennedy's words of thanks and express my gratitude for your time today. So with that, the first question. There is deep political divide in Washington on many domestic issues. But when it comes to China, there is largely bipartisan support in seeing Beijing as an ever-growing threat to the United States economically, politically, militarily. China has become the world's second largest economy in 2010. Many, of course, have warned that its continued growth is unsustainable, but for now, the difference between the economic might between the United States and China continues to narrow. So in your view, are those threat perceptions about China shared by the countries you visited? And how do you see the United States working more closely together with like-minded countries in the face of China upending the regional status quo?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. We certainly appreciate Mark Shioto and certainly the Wilson Center. Before we start, I just want to say a few things about my colleague, Rob Whitman, who we both serve on each other's committees, Sea Power and Tactical Air and Land, and we've had the honor of traveling literally around the world for the past 8 years or so. And you're right, Mark, there is no better way to get a better understanding of what each of us are thinking than to sit alongside somebody as we did in this one for 70 hours on an airplane. But it goes to speak volumes, and you had mentioned the disruption, particularly in Congress. Here's one of the bright spots. It's called the House Armed Services Committee. Of course, we will have policy differences, but I am so proud to serve on that committee because we focus on what is important to the defense of our country. Yes, we'll have a little squirrel fight over here, over there, but we are focused together and are together on most of the issues, particularly with China. Over the course, I would say in the last 6 years, there has been a significant change of view and of opinion on the way we're looking at China. If we go back a generation, nobody looked to China for anything other than potentially just cheap labor. How can we get things done? Well, that is significantly different today. Visiting Guam, Australia, just recently is one of many times that we have been down there. And what we see is our allies and partners understanding at a much different level than he did just a short decade ago. So I believe there are groups of our allies and partners who fully understand the true threat that is out there.
Well, listen, I want to echo Don's comments about the true bipartisan attitude of folks on the House Armed Services Committee. And Don is a dear friend. He and I have traveled multiple times together, have great conversations about the things that need to happen on the Armed Services Committee. And I can tell you, in most instances, there is hardly a molecule of difference between Don and myself on the things that need to happen. So it's a real pleasure and honor to travel with him. It's a great learning experience for me, but also an opportunity to continue to build that friendship. And those friendships are what really create the foundation to get things done. That I believe is what makes a successful legislator, is developing those relationships. And I really value my friendship and professional efforts that go hand in hand with what Don does. Don pointed out a great example of how the countries in that area of the world are now viewing China. They're much like the United States. The United States view has changed on China. As we talked with the Australians before COVID, they looked at China in a very different way. They saw how China reacted during COVID. Our conversations with them were about as stark as they could be in how Australia views China. They do not view China as their friend. They view China as a strategic adversary. And I think that's exactly what led to this new AUKUS agreement, which I believe allows Australia to ramp up their efforts to counter what happens with China in the region. The same with Vietnam. While we didn't get a chance to visit there because of some weather conditions, we did meet with the Vietnamese delegation prior to traveling to that area of the world. And the Vietnamese delegation was very adamant to say that they saw the threats from China as real. They saw them both strategically and economically. They did say, though, that they didn't want to have to choose between the United States and China because they have to live in the same neighborhood as China. But they are adamant as to how they see China treating Vietnam and that they want a stronger relationship with the United States. I would argue that that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. And the same with the Philippines. You know, we have a treaty with the Philippines. With the new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., there is a different attitude there than there was under President Duterte. And that goes back historically with what happened at Scarborough Reef and the aggressive efforts China's undertaking in building essentially reef areas into militarized islands in the South China Sea. The Philippines sees that as a threat. They want a strong relationship with the United States. So I think there are many more strategic opportunities for the United States in that region due to the incredibly aggressive behavior by China, which I think is only going to continue. The People's Congress there, I think, will give Xi Jinping another term, which essentially entrenches him for as long as he wants to be there. I think that will embolden him and I believe provide even more opportunity for him to pursue aggressive behavior in that area, to include potential efforts to bring Taiwan closer into China's orbit.
Well, thank you for both of those great insights. You also saw military capabilities, and you see it every day on your committees. What are the military capabilities that America has or is developing that you believed, based on what you've learned in this trip and other trips, are most critical to deterring China aggression?
Well, I think it's twofold. I'll quickly turn it over to Don. I think it's twofold. First of all, it's building a sea services presence there. That is our Navy Marine Corps team. The Navy has an effort underway to build more ships. They need to be doing that. I think an important aspect of that is the Commandant's Force Design 2030 that is focused on building stand-in forces in the Pacific to make sure that they are agile and adaptable and flexible, and that they have intra-theater connectors like the Land Amphibious Warfare Vessel, which this year we've actually moved to the left to try to speed that up so they can have those intra-theater connectors. That's going to be incredibly important in the region. The Air Force also will be unveiling the B-21 Raider, the new deep penetrating bomber in December. That is an incredible capability in that region that's going to provide the ability for us to deter China. And then also the KC-46A, which, by the way, is built there in elements of it in Don's district. The KC-46A gives us that ability to reach long distances. Tanking is a strategic capability that's incredibly important. The KC-46A gives us that opportunity.
Thanks. I'd like to say all the above. And there are a number of those, but Rob brings up a number of points. First of all, this is an away game for us. China is playing on their home turf, and certainly that gives them some of that strategic advantage. But if you remember, we know how to operate in this theater. Been doing it through many conflicts over the years. And in many ways, because the domains that we're looking at that used to simply, I say that air, land, and sea, both above and below water, now has expanded. It's now cyber, it's space. So the space is still significant and real, but there are other opportunities to bring that space down a little bit quicker. Rob talked about the sea assets. There's no question that the 5th generation fighters we have, the F-35, particularly with our partners in Japan, soon to be Singapore and Australia, have a great advantage here that only China would like to get to. And we are quite frankly well beyond that, well into our 6th generation. That, along with long range fires, I get back to my original statement, all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Those are important capabilities. And as you described your trip, you spent as much time flying there as being there. It highlights the tyranny of distance that we need to deal with when we're in that district. And certainly we commend the commandant's reforms and new strategies that are clearly designed for that area. Shihoko?
Yeah, so I'd like to turn to sentiment in the region. And a prominent Singaporean think tank, ISEAS, released its latest annual survey of ASEAN sentiment in the region this summer. Its poll of analysts, opinion makers, corporate executives, political leaders found that 76% of those in the 10 Southeast Asian countries see China as the most influential economic power in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, the country that the ASEAN countries trusted the most was not the United States, but it was actually Japan. Nevertheless, when they were asked about their biggest concerns for the region, it wasn't about competition between the United States and China. In fact, the top 3 concerns by those polled were, in an order of importance: 1, dealing with the pandemic and broader health challenges; 2, coping with joblessness and the possibility of an economic recession; and thirdly, climate change. So many in the United States would also prioritize some, if not all, of these concerns as well. Both of you work closely with your constituents on dealing with challenges of unemployment, workforce development, and of course, dealing with the fallout of COVID. What are the prospects for the United States to work together with countries like Vietnam, as well as Australia, on these issues that really know no national boundaries?
Thank you. It's a great question. It's, as I like to say, is what are they discussing around their kitchen table? What is the impact to them and to their families? And you bring up the pandemic. It's been a rough few years, not only for us, but for the world. Friends, family dying, people in their homes for a long period of time. So that has made a profound impact across the board. We see it in our country, and certainly they do. But one of the first differences that we see between the way our country operated and the way China did is helping other countries who did not have the ability to produce a vaccine, to use a vaccine, to get those healthcare. That made a significant difference in those countries, the way they viewed each of us. Some suggest the cause might have come from one country, the other one is creating a way to keep from those loved ones dying. But the second thing you mentioned is jobs. The ability to take care of your family is important no matter where you live. Your family is your core values, and that's what we see happening across the board. And when we were in Australia, Guam, when we look at that next generation of leadership, and more importantly, is how do we produce the different products we'll need, from the weapons we'll need to literally keeping our country going, is a significant challenge. Workforce development is probably in the top 3 of all the long-term issues we're facing. How do we get that? But then we're in an area that there is water all around, and climate and the rising waters is something that we hear time and time again, particularly when we deal with the island chains through there. This is a very real issue that is fundamentally an issue they see each and every day. And there's great concern. So I think there's some great opportunity, but again, as the further we can come away from the pandemic, the further we can share some of our health and economic prosperity, I think the better off we'll be. Quite contrast to what we're seeing from China.
Yeah. You know, I think the concerns that were expressed in that survey have a common thread that run between those top 3 items, and that is what we've seen in areas of the world as a weakness in manufacturing and supply chains. And whether it's PPE for the COVID-19 pandemic, or whether it's elements that now starting to creep in with economic conditions around the world, I think one of the incredibly important things that we have to address are economic relationships, reducing reliance on China. And we do that by increasing manufacturing here in the United States, and then in turn, using that to enhance economic relationships with other countries, specifically countries like Vietnam. Vietnam wants a much stronger economic relationship with the United States. And I think that gives us the ability to pursue bilateral agreements with countries like Vietnam, where you can have now manufacturing assets in both countries that are to their advantage. And as you look at trade relationships, all of a sudden you become less dependent on China. I would argue that places like Vietnam in Southeast Asia, which is the fastest growing economy in the world, are very much like Japan was in the 1960s, emerging economies that have a tremendous boom in manufacturing capability. We ought to be building on that, as well as building our own manufacturing capabilities here. You know, a great example is active pharmaceutical ingredients, things that we are reliant upon China on for producing the pharmaceuticals that we need. That needs to come back to the United States. The good news is we're starting down that road, but the bad news is we're still overly reliant on China. But that points to opportunity and ways for us to solve these problems, and that is stronger economic relationships with ASEAN countries and building our manufacturing base here in the United States.
I think those are both very important issues, and helping there be an understanding that actually a more robust relationship with the ASEAN countries could mean less dependence on China.
Yes.
And that's a very positive step forward. We just spoke about jobs, but you saw some of your constituents on the job there on your trips that happened to be in Guam or around the area. And I know, Congressman Whitman, you represent the Marines who need a lot of islands, you know, in the area for their new strategy, and it makes it increasingly important. Help us understand some of the folks you met along the way, and then how those relationships with countries like Philippines that have a lot of very strategically placed islands help us with our deterrence effort.
Well, it was very exciting to meet with all the members of the military, but especially talking to Marines there as they are moving Marines and assets from Okinawa to Guam to have a more dispersed capability there in the Pacific. And as you know, the Commandant's Force Design 2030 puts forth the concept of stand-in forces. That is to put stand-in forces there in the Indo-Pacific to make sure we have a dispersed force which makes it less vulnerable, to make sure too, we have various assets there, especially long-range strike assets, long-range anti-ship missiles, long-range precision strike, the things that we can do to hold China and their assets in the region at risk, disperse them. So there's not one single place that China can go to be able to take out that threat that they see from those assets. And then also to make sure too, that we have the elements of logistics taken care of. To have those stand-in forces and to have that dispersal that reduces risk, you have to be able to move things around. So intra-theater connectors like the light amphibious warfare ship are going to be incredibly important. Having a foundation of 31 amphibious ships in our fleet, making sure that they are available to go to sea, is incredibly important. I just visited with the 13th MEU. They're getting ready to go on deployment there in the Pacific, an incredibly capable force. And that is the deterrent force that we need in that particular region to make sure we're doing the things necessary to deter China. So I'm optimistic about how those things are unfolding. I'm optimistic about how the Commandant is taking Force Design 2030 and continuing to test it and refine it so that it is ready to go when they are called upon. Another element too that we have to keep in mind is, you spoke of the tyranny of distance. The tyranny of distance brings into the forefront logistics. That is, how do you not only get a force there, but how do you sustain the force once it's there? Our problem is our logistics elements, our sea lift specifically, is anemic at best. We have a very, very small ready reserve fleet, 41 ships, all well over 40 years of age on average. And we have a maritime security program of just a little over 60 ships. Put that in context to what we needed to mobilize to pursue the Gulf War, Desert Storm. There were over 360 ships that were there to mobilize and to sustain that operation. So you see what we face in the Indo-PACOM with a very aged and less capable logistics fleet. That's another area too that we have to look at. And when we talk to folks in the region from all service branches, that was one of their concerns, is the logistical element that's necessary to be successful in the Asia Pacific. In the Indo-PACOM is going to be critical to make sure that we can have that as a significant element of deterrence in the area.
Rob says it all, and that's why we see those commercials on TV. It is all about logistics, not just day one,
Yes.
long term. And that is a challenge that the United States has faced in each of its conflicts down in that part of the world. I want to get back to the original question. I was up at our joint base, McGuire-Dix, Lakehurst, about a month and a half ago, visiting the refueling wing, where they're just bringing in the KC-46, the new refueler, and seeing the men and women. And they say, by the way, the 108th is down in Guam. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, we're down visiting Colonel Tagger with CQ Brown in Guam. That is the global reach of our logistics that no other nation in the world can do. The latest is KC-46, but there are a number of other platforms that we deal with. Always a challenge, but to see those young men and women operating here in my hometown and in Guam just tells you what is so special about our military. Those sons and daughters who decide to put service before themselves and literally defend us around the country. But those long distances take a tremendous amount of resources. I agree 100% with Rob about our fleet, which is, calling it aging is a nice term. We're changing that dynamics, but it's going to take time. And this is one of the challenges and why it's so important to have friends and allies that we can pre-position so many of our assets in that area. But still, it's not a one-day conflict. If it comes, they are long-term, and we have to be able to do that.
Well, we certainly appreciate all their service and all of our fighting forces, men and women that are out there defending us every day. And you're absolutely right. As we wrestle with those distances, but we also wrestled with the many missiles that China has pointed at the region and the anti-access aerial denial, and that Force Design 2030 that the Marines are putting forth is in tandem with what we're seeing the Air Force and the Navy, Air Force with their ACE program, Navy with their distributed drones and others to expand the dispersion of the fleet, and it makes a huge difference. And the KC-46 help us have the fuel to get there, but you're right, the domestic cargo carrying via vessels that we have is indeed in short supply. Someone just recently wrote an op-ed saying we need a SHIPS Act similar to the CHIPS Act in order to expand our fleet in terms of as you described. Shihoko.
So I'd like to ask about capacity building in the region, and AUKUS has already been mentioned, but we have great expectations for Australia's role in developing and maintaining nuclear submarines through the agreement. Australia, of course, is a staunch ally of the United States, but it is also a country, a vast country that has no homegrown nuclear technology, either for military or for industrial use. Australia has no nuclear power plants, let alone submarines. How can the United States work with Australia and ensure that it becomes an effective partner? And how can the United States work to ensure technology transfer to build the nuclear industrial capacity that Australia does need?
Well, this was our very first conversation upon landing in Australia. They are keenly aware of the development of a workforce to not only build, but to maintain. Now, remember, they are very good in underseas operations. The nuclear capacity is something different. And let's be sure that everybody listening understands the most complicated machine in the history of mankind is one of our nuclear submarines. We do a great job. We have some great partners, particularly with Great Britain, and that is going to be what we bring to the Aussies and they share with us. But you still need a workforce that's able to do it. We are facing the very same challenges, not to the degree of starting from a new nuclear program, but who is that next generation worker? We met with the leadership of Southern Australia, and that he comes out of labor unions. He understands the challenges that not only are you able to develop and train those groups, but you need them to want to go into that line of work. And the narrative that takes place in Australia is not all that different than it is here in the US. So often you hear, in order to make it in America, you have to go to college. Well, that's great for some, but not for all. We need the doctors, we need the lawyers, but you know what? We need the welders. We need the mechanics that can put this all together. So the ability to attract that next generation, not only with ourselves, but with our partners in Australia, keenly aware of and focused on. And we had talked about how those apprenticeships, we can exchange some of the training methods that we use with our people and vice versa. So something that they're very much aware of, but it's a matter of building their capacity they have now and growing it, which they will need over the course of the next decade.
Yeah. Listen, I think Don is spot on. Workforce is that central element of what the Australians need to develop, as well as a submarine force. And that's why it's so critical to have Australian submariners training shoulder to shoulder with U.S. submariners on board Virginia class, and not just for, a week or two, but for an entire deployment cycle. Their shipbuilders need to be here in the United States, shoulder to shoulder with U.S. shipbuilders through a full construction cycle for a Virginia class submarine, from the cutting of the first piece of steel to the launch of that boat. They need to be here for that, because that's the level of training that they're going to need to manufacture those submarines. You're right. They have no industrial capability to produce reactors. That's why I believe what will happen with this is that the United States company, BWXT, which just happens to be in Virginia, in Lynchburg, Virginia, that produces those nuclear reactors, will indeed produce the nuclear reactors for Australian submarines. There's a whole back and forth about Australia's nuclear policy and about the International Atomic Energy Commission and what their issues are with nuclear reactors there in Australia. I think the way to do that is to just say that BWXT will produce those reactors. They'll be shipped to Australia and their shipbuilders will install them in those submarines. And then that helps both on the security side in the classification of how those reactors are put together, but also on the safety side, on the non-proliferation side. All those things I think can be worked out when you have that manufacturing capability here in the United States. And it may be one day that that Australia changes their policy and will go forward with production of nuclear reactors. But in the meantime, I think it'll be the United States that will supply the reactors for the boats that the Australians build. And Don's right, the workforce there is critically important. Those skills are very unique to nuclear submarines, those welders, those machinists, those craftsmen there. And by the way, Don, as you know, also electricians are part of that. Don being a great leader in IBEW there for years, an electrician himself. So he and I have an affinity for that, both growing up in that field. But those things are incredibly important. And I think that we can address those issues. Obviously, we know China's making an issue on the non-proliferation elements and what happens internationally. But I think those issues are very easily addressed in putting Australia in the position to not be in conflict with their own laws or the non-proliferation agreements that are there internationally.
And as you talk about them working side by side in building the new subs together so that they understand how it's done, I understand that we're going to likely be building the first couple of them here in America for Australia, and having to expand our industrial capacity. Talk a little bit about our own industrial capacity for some of the key elements, such as submarines, that we need to be able to have the capacity to build here in America that is being very stretched at the current point in time.
It is. That's a great point. I'm a little concerned about talking about building submarines for the Australians. And listen, we need to do everything we can to make sure the Australians have those nuclear submarines. But here's where we are. We should be at a point of building 2 Virginia-class submarines a year. We are not there. We are at about 1.5, 1.4 submarines per year at best. And that's because we're coming out of COVID. If you look at where we dip with SSNs, the requirement is well north of 50. We're going to drop to 42 if we don't do something in the meantime. That means increasing the production rate. As you know, we're also looking at putting in the spare reactor plants that we have on hand in some of the 688 submarines, the Los Angeles class submarines, to extend their service life, to get us out of that bathtub where we'll drop down to 42. The requirement is, I believe, 54. So we have to find a way for ourselves to get out of that bathtub. And when you put on top of that now having to build some additional submarines for Australia, it creates, I think, its own set of issues. Here's what I think we need to do. I think that we need to do everything we can to get to a pace of building 2, 3, 2, 3, that pace of building 2 1 year, 3 the next year, 2 the next year, 3 the next year. I think we can sustain that rate of production. That gets us up to our base minimum requirement at a faster pace. And in that situation, what I believe we can do is to build U.S. submarines, and then with one of those submarines, do a joint agreement of deployment with Australian submariners in the Australian AOR, and have that submarine jointly operated with Australia in the United States. So we have an Australian crew on board. We have joint commanders on board, Australian and U.S., and we have the U.S. and Australia jointly command that submarine. And what is it going to do and where is it going to be? And that way, it's still a U.S. asset while they are building capability to build their own submarine. And that way, they can have the coverage that they'll need as the Collins-class submarines age out, and as they're waiting for their first Australian submarine to be built. And remember, there's a political reality that Australia has to deal with. These need to be Australian submarines. And, you know, the Australians are going to look for Australians to be building those submarines. So I think we have to be careful about saying, oh, this is going to be, you know, a U.S. effort. And this has to be an Australian effort, with the U.S. being the guide and being the partner there. I don't think that we can appear as though we're taking this over and that this is a U.S. enterprise, especially with the bathtub that we'll go through with our own attack submarine fleet.
Rob brings up an excellent point. We know how we care about the workforce in our country, and they care about theirs. There are no better partners in Australia. They're part of our Five Eyes. We do things with Australia through the intelligence, through our defense, that few other countries could even imagine. But they do want to make sure they build their capacity. I can't tell you how many times they talked about, we're not looking to compete, we want to complement. Sharing the technology, sharing the workplace methods of building a nuclear sub are a complex and long-term strategy that we will build up to. They will need to build up to that, just as we are. Rob talked about increasing our capacity. We've talked about this for the last 6 years, is how do we build up the capacity? The fact of the matter is, we have the ability, but we also need to send the correct signals to industry that this is just not a 1 year plus up, and then we'll lay everybody off. That sort of got us into the position we are now, that there's a long-term growth path to building these submarines, and that is incredibly important. But the other item is to make sure that you can build it, but you must operate it. The amendment that Joe Courtney put in that talked about that joint training, you don't do that in one cycle. That is a matter of year after year in cycle. So Rob hit the nail on the head on this one, is you have to build each of our capacities, complementing the other one, working with them, but then you also need that interoperability, not only with our country, Great Britain, and certainly Australia, but you need to be able to operate the most complicated machine in the world. And that takes time and experience.
And having that interoperability with our allies in this region certainly extends our own collective capabilities in a very important way. So thanks for sharing that. Shihoko? Mute.
I think I've been doing this for long enough. Sorry. So we've been talking about sharing technology, interoperability. These are critical not just for the AUKUS agreement, but for many of the strategic partnerships that the United States is going to move forward with. And of course, just from a cost perspective too, Washington can be a far stronger and effective power to push back against Chinese economic coercion, violations of the rule of law, and other transgressions by Beijing, if it can work effectively together with its allies. But I'm afraid I have to bring up an uncomfortable truth, and that is to say that even some of America's most staunchest of supporters in the region are wary about continued consistent US commitment to the Indo-Pacific. And we talk about, continued investments, continued commitment. If that trust of that longstanding commitment of the United States is shaken, then a lot of the conversations we're having is going to be moot. So how important are like-minded partners for the United States? And perhaps most importantly, how can Washington regain and reaffirm the trust of Asia and its commitment as a Pacific power?
Well, I like to think about this as how we treat our family, but it's important to start off. Nobody ever lost our trust. It's like a relative. You have that blood connection, you're always there, but you could have probably stopped by a little bit more often. And quite frankly, the world's a very big place. the fact that we're having this conversation about South China Sea, China, the entire region, while Ukraine and Europe are under tremendous pressure. Our forces are designed to have two major conflicts. And the fact of the matter is, we could have spent more time with our relatives. And I think we've seen what happens when we don't. I think that has changed tremendously, particularly with Australia and New Zealand, who are redoubling their efforts as part of this coalition, I will say, of our family together. I think there was a wake-up call over the course of the last 18 months that we are responding to. And as they say, we're taking a cup of sugar to our neighbors to make sure that they understand we've always been there.
Yeah. Listen, I think there's great opportunity there. We have to use the relationships that we have with countries in the region, such as Australia and Japan and others, to pursue a deeper engagement and efforts with many of the Pacific Island nations who have for years kind of been on the outside looking in. As we know, China has aggressively pursued relationships with those nations, culminating in one instance with a formal security agreement with one of those island nations. Our effort has begun now to have a deep conversation with those nations about what we can do as a partner with them. As you know, we've dedicated some resources to the region for that effort, about $800 million now to reinvigorate that effort so that nations there know that we are going to be there, not just in words, but in deeds and in presence. You know, when we talk about the repositioning to the Indo-PACOM, what happened is we talked about that, but people didn't see any results. So I think people in the region are looking at the United States and go, okay, listen, y'all are talk a great game. You talk about all these things that you're going to do. But I think those nations now are watching and saying, okay, are you going to do what you say you're going to do? Because we've watched China become much, much more active in the region and pursue these sorts of agreements that really tie these nations much more closely to China. The question is are we going to pursue deeper relationships? And will we act upon those? And will they manifest themselves in things that improve the situations for the countries that we're involved with? I think that they will. It will take an incredible amount of effort, and it will take the United States doing what they say they're going to do.
If I can do a follow-up to that, one of the issues that arose was the United States abandoning the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement. Now the Biden administration has come forward with the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity Agreement, which has brought together 14 countries from across the Indo-Pacific, including the Pacific island of Fiji,
Yes.
on board.
Yes.
It doesn't seem as controversial as TPP. It seems to have bipartisan support in Congress. There is nevertheless concern that should there be a change in administration, that the United States may not necessarily follow through with IPEF. Do you think there is adequate support on both sides of the political aisle to make sure that IPEF actually has legs?
Well, I do, because this framework is different than TPP. I think there's an opportunity there for us to engage with those nations in a long-term way, whereas TPP was somewhat transactional. This is much more long-term in building relationships with those nations to strengthen things economically and to look at where both sides can benefit. That has to be the foundation of this. And listen, I think those elements are there. And I think that that's where the bipartisan agreement will occur, because I think more and more people realize that if we are going to have the ability to counter China in that region, if we're going to have the ability to have influence in that region with partners, and that is to influence partnerships, to encourage folks to partner with the United States economically and strategically, we have to have these sorts of agreements. And these sorts of agreements are the conduits for us to make things happen. This is about actions. I think for far too long, the United States has talked a good game, but hasn't actually come to the table and done things. In the countries across the Indo-Pacific look at that and go, yeah, you guys keep talking, but you haven't done anything. So this is an opportunity for us to act, an opportunity for us to show that these relationships are meaningful and that they can be mutually beneficial. And I think that's the key on what Congress will look for is, are these relationships mutually beneficial? I think they can be. I think they need to be. And I think folks realize too that in the absence of these formal relationships and agreements with the United States, China will occupy that space. So it's up to the United States to make sure we're there in what we say we're going to do.
Rob has an excellent point from a top level. I agree with the concept. One of our major challenges is the reality of what that means to the people we represent. I can drive you around our district, as most members of Congress can, and show you what I call the carcasses of past trade agreements, where overall for the country, we benefited, but for those who had those jobs and lost them, that's as real as it gets. And that's the fear that strikes into those constituents when they hear trade agreement. Oh, I remember that. My neighbor lost his job 10 years ago and he's making half what he used to. So the reality of what it means to our constituents is incredibly important. But why this can be different and very different from where we were just a few short years ago is now we're encompassing and actually having real discussions on about environmental standards, labor standards, anti-corruption standards. You know, go back 5 years, climate was always there, but not anywhere near the concern we are now. The pandemic has changed the views of so many governments on people because now they're starting to speak about these things. And Rob's right. I think this can be bipartisan. Our last agreement literally had the support of much of labor. That's groundbreaking because we're discussing the issues that not only affect the country we're dealing with, but our country and the loss of jobs. That needs to be a win for both, not just part of our society. And that's why I think this can and will be different.
Well, that's very encouraging, and having that kind of bipartisan support would be fabulous. I mean, I think as we've already discussed, a lot of this is about being less dependent on China and having Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries providing some of the stuff that we had to look for China to in the past. So it's not really about, and I think it can be crafted in a way where it's not taking jobs from America. It's just making sure that we're more diversified in those areas where we have sourced things historically. I think one of those Pacific islands you had a chance to meet, and there are a lot of benefits. You know, you had a chance to meet Chief of Staff General C.Q. Brown. The Air Force is working hard to have more airstrips spread around the region to disperse their forces. Those islands are important for that. We've talked about the logistics challenge. Having more places where we can pre-position supplies helps with the logistic force. But I had a chance to go to Guam recently myself, and at that time we had not yet approved some of the measures to increase the base defense, as that base is so important to us. It's where the sun comes up in America. Tell us about Guam. People may not really understand the importance of it and some of the developments that are happening there to improve its own security. And Congressman Whitman, you already talked about that. We're also bringing in some of the Marines there, so it's becoming even more important to us.
Well, as you mentioned, it's where every day starts. Guam as a significant part of our history of this country and why we're still here today talking on this platform. When we were visiting just recently, we see the tremendous amount of construction that is taking place. And quite frankly, we got a very deep dive into the current defense posture and where we are going in the interim. Significant because of the assets we have on the island. But all conversations begin with, that is the United States. The idea that China is going to launch an attack on Guam, I think is going to be catastrophic for China. I think we have to continue to build our defenses there and our capabilities. But remember, an attack on Guam is an attack on the United States. They talk a good game, but are they ready to put at risk everything they hold valuable to their people? Attacking the United States is a big deal. One that I'm not sure they're ready for the response that they're going to get. But we have to be ready, and I think Rob will talk more about this. What we have in place and what we are having in place literally day by day as we build it is significant, and will certainly put that extra deterrent on China before they decide literally pull the trigger.
Yes, I agree with Don. The strategic importance of Guam for the United States, and for that matter, for the entire Indo-PACOM, cannot be underestimated. It is, I believe, the most important strategic placement of the United States asset anywhere in the Indo-PACOM. So the question then becomes, how do we make sure we have the proper laydown of forces there? From our strategic bombers at Anderson Air Force Base to the placement of Marines at the new facilities there, making sure that we have the ability to project power from there and also to sustain power from there. So that becomes incredibly important in both of those realms. The Marines' plans in their stand-in force laydown and Force Design 2030 in the Indo-PACOM centers around Marine Corps assets there at Guam, which they are moving there from Okinawa, and then they'll be placing some in Darwin, Australia. So that dispersal of forces there and the ability to amass those forces and then sustain stand-in forces that will be scattered throughout islands in the Indo-PACOM is going to be incredibly important. Guam is the main conduit to make that happen. We know the new B-21 Raider aircraft is going to be unveiled in December. Deep penetrating strike, unbelievable aircraft. That aircraft, I know, will be an important part of Air Force assets there in Guam. That's another opportunity for us to make sure that we can place China at risk as a deterrent. You know, the B-52 bombers that we have there that can do long range strike, incredibly important. So Guam itself as not only as a U.S. territory, but also as a U.S. military capability is incredible. And it will be the linchpin for us to be able to deter China in the Indo-PACOM. And to see the things that are happening there, to see the capability that we have is pretty amazing, especially for an island that small. And the other element that's important too is that there is a very high degree of support from the people in Guam. And as you know, they have one of the most incredible National Guard units of any National Guard unit anywhere. And listen, our National Guard units across the nation are incredible, and the Guam National Guard unit is one of them. So to see the support and the interest that Guam has in the United States military and their own National Guard is really uplifting. And we had the chance to see that when we were there. So Don and I know we're incredibly impressed by what we saw in the building capability that's underway. And
I hope all Americans understand that is America. They have a National Guard because they are part of America, territory of the United States. A lot of islands across the Pacific that we want to build deeper relationships, but it is important for Americans to know that is America. And as you mentioned, Congressman Norcross, if missiles actually do flow its way, they're flowing towards America, and we need to be cognizant of that. And hopefully anybody who decides to send them is understanding that's the case as well.
Yes.
Shihoko. Yeah, well, I'm afraid we've actually are now at the end of, or close to the end of our hour-long discussion. And as an analyst of Asian affairs, I'm very grateful to you both for taking the time to visit Australia, Vietnam, and of course, Guam, which is so going to be such a central part of the defense strategy of the United States moving forward. Vietnam, Australia, they are key drivers of regional growth and stability. And yet, despite the technological advancements that we've seen, we still have a really long way to go to deal with the challenges of time difference and, of course, the challenge of distance that it actually takes to get to these countries. The fact that you carved out time from your very busy schedules to meet with regional leaders and stakeholders and listen to their concerns, hear their perspectives on the global challenges and how they can work together with the United States. I think to hear that firsthand is really priceless. And the willingness for you to listen is critical to any successful partnership. And I hope that you will continue to steer the United States towards even greater cooperation and partnership with the Indo-Pacific by being there, by listening, by engaging. And so thank you very much for your service. Thank you again for joining us here today at the Wilson Center.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.